Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 260, The Bible. It's alive! Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we kick off a series where we are looking at the Bible, specifically the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish version of the Bible. And we're looking at it, though, from a variety of lenses that one might call non-traditional, or certainly not the lenses that we tend to have in Hebrew school or in Jewish day schools. And that includes academic Bible study, right? The way that the Bible is studied in universities these days, and also all kinds of other ways that people are studying the Bible, using the Bible, thinking about the Bible for our contemporary world. So today, to kick off the series, we're going to be talking to a professor of Hebrew Bible, Ronald Hendel. He is the Norma and Sam Dabby Professor of Hebrew Bible and Jewish Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. He is also the author of many books on the Hebrew Bible, some of them meant for an academic audience and some of them meant for a popular audience. In the latter category, he is the author of The Book of Genesis, a biography, which is part of the Lives of Great Religious Book series that's been put out by Princeton University Press. I always like to note when a book that we're discussing is available as an audiobook, on the theory that podcast listeners might like to read in the form of an audiobook. I know I do. And this book, The Book of Genesis, a biography, is available on audio. Ronald Hendel is also the author of Remembering Abraham, Culture, Memory, and History in the Hebrew Bible. And he's also the co-author of a book on a subject that I find really fascinating, that I think is really interesting and important, and we'll talk about it, called How Old is the Hebrew Bible? In addition to all this, Ronald Hendel is the editor-in-chief of the Hebrew Bible, a critical edition, a new critical edition of the Hebrew text, whose first volume on Proverbs was published in 2015, and he's writing a new commentary on Genesis for the Yale Anchor Bible. So, Ronald Hendel, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Oh, my pleasure.
So I wanted to start with the kind of scientific analysis of the Bible. I think it's not necessarily where people generally start, but you've written about and spoken about the age of the material in the Bible, and I think that's both an interesting question and also it's interesting how you figure that out. So could you talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. Yeah, I co-wrote a book called How Old is the Hebrew Bible? And basic point is that the Hebrew language has its own history. And once you get a grasp of that history, you can see when different books of the Bible were written. Sometimes there's different layers of composition in different biblical books. And so sometimes you can tell which is the earlier layer and which is the latest layer. This is something that biblical scholars in particular have been interested in for several hundred years. And so we wanted to make a strong case that there's more that we can say than previous people thought you could, simply by understanding the language. So how the verbs work and how prepositions work. So it's a little bit like if you read Shakespeare, you can zoom in on the details and see what aspects of the language have changed between then and now. And you can kind of do a sequential sort of thing. So some of the stuff in the Bible reads archaic, kind of Shakespearean stuff. Some of it is newer. And once you get a handle on how to do that, then you can really tell, the relative age of things. And then if you look at Hebrew inscriptions from outside the Bible that are found in archaeology and stuff, and so you know when they were found, then you can kind of cross-reference these different strata in the Bible to actual datable texts.
Is there any evidence that there were people who did notice that the language in the Bible was different in different parts?
Yes, that's a good question. In the Talmud, there are references to people saying, well, we know that this part of the language is older than others. And so they make a distinction between the language of the Bible and the language of the rabbis, for example. But certainly by the time you get to medieval times, scholars in Spain were learning a lot about linguistic inquiry from Muslim scholars who were studying Arabic. And this is an earlier locution. This is a later locution. This is how you say it in the Bible. This is how you would say it in the Mishnah. So there's a rudiment of awareness that the language changed over time. Now, one of the things that makes this controversial in let's say, medieval times, to say that the Book of Chronicles, let's say, has a later vocabulary or later syntax than the books of Samuel and Kings, you're treading on certain issues that are complicated. And certainly if you talk about the Torah, the books of the Torah, if no one could say that, the book of Leviticus has a later stratum of the language than big chunks of the book of Genesis. Because at that time, the idea is that it was all written by Moses or dictated by God to Moses. And so that was not really a thinkable thought. So this whole area burgeoned in 19th century Germany when you could start thinking about these sorts of... Spinoza was really the first one that blew the lid on this, that Moses didn't write all of the Torah. So once that idea became less controversial, then you could sort of patiently cultivate this kind of activity. But it's still, of course, controversial because lots of people still think that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and you can't say that Leviticus is later than Genesis.
Somebody could hear what you're talking about. Okay, the Bible, how old is it? Is it this many centuries old? Is it this many centuries old? This many millennia is probably a better order of magnitude. But I'm going to be asking this of other people in our conversations during this unit too, but who cares? I'm not asking that as an attack. I actually care very much myself. But if somebody's listening and is like, okay, so parts of Genesis are, 2,500 years old versus 3,000 years old or something, so what? Why would it make a difference to me in 2021 how long ago it was or which century it was? And, I have some guesses. From my perspective, I think of certain books that are not the Bible. Let's say the book of Maccabees is one obvious example, that being written so the book of Maccabees being a story about an actual historical set of events. It's not necessarily a perfect telling of those events, but for us to look at that and be like, oh, it matters if that was written right as the events were happening or a bunch after, right? Because if it's written a bunch after, then, there's some guesswork involved, all that. So that's kind of an obvious situation. But with Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus or even other non-Torah books of the Bible, so what? Who cares whether it's this many centuries old or some other number of centuries old?
Yeah, I think you're totally right that the other issues that this links into, issues of, what in this particular book might be historical or not, or how might the past be being remembered and reconstituted through the literary imagination of the author or something like that. If you're decades away from event, let's say the story of King David, if you're decades away or even a century away from the events, there's an expectation that there's going to be more accurate historical stuff because there's people around who remember that, or people around who, for whom they heard the stories about this. And so there's a kind of cultural memory. If it's written 600 years after the event, okay, then you can say, well, there's no necessary history anywhere in the book, and we don't even know if King David existed and all this sort of stuff. So if you're interested in questions of history, then the questions of how old this or that book is absolutely crucial. It doesn't answer the question of how much in the book of Samuel is historically accurate, but it helps you think about that. It helps you think about that in an intelligent way.
So you mean that me talking as if I have knowledge of what Christopher Columbus was doing is probably not, us talking as if we know exactly what that was is probably comparable to certain kinds of things that might have been happening in the Bible? 600 years is what I was thinking of. Or I guess 500 years and change.
Absolutely. And if you think about, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, these are people who are closer to us. If you want to learn things about these people, you would trust more someone who's either an eyewitness or living within a few decades rather than if you wrote that book today about Christopher Columbus without doing any research at all, and you could say anything you want.
There have been times when I've thought about writing a historical novel. I actually have a historical novel that I think of writing that has to do with around the time of the Second Temple. And I keep getting intimidated by it because I realize how much research I would have to do on just like the smallest detail, like what kind of clothes did people wear? What kind of houses did they live in? Where, I would have to do all this research. Otherwise, even though I had a really good story, somebody would come and say, well, that's completely wrong because they didn't wear that kind of clothes. And so when I think about somebody writing the Bible, the question that I have is beyond the syntax and the language, can we tell based on other elements that are in the stories about whether the person who wrote it really knew about the time that it purports to be written at? Or is that really not a major part of how we do the analysis?
No, that's a major part. I mean, you have to get a sense of what sort of thing the writer is writing, what the genre is. If someone's writing kind of a folktale sort of thing about the prophet Jonah, and he gets swallowed by a big fish and things like that, genre indicators that this is a kind of fable. Whereas if you have something like, the books of Samuel or Kings, where you're talking about kings, who are presumably actual historical figures, and there's actual political battles, and there's people, murdering each other and conniving to get power and so forth, it not only has more of a sense of verisimilitude, but it seems more like a reportage of actual political events. Now, these are not easy determinations to make. Any reader of a book, you have to make those judgments. I mean, if you're reading Tolstoy's account of Napoleon's wars, you sort of know it's a different sort of thing than if you're reading a textbook by a historian. But there's other things that Tolstoy might have insight into because he's a keen reader of human psychology and such that a historian would be much more clunky about. So knowing or trying to ascertain what kind of work of literature it is helps you kind of think your way into these issues. But they're all difficult issues. It's very difficult to make judgments about particular details unless we have something outside of the Bible that you can point to. The Assyrian siege of Jerusalem that happened around 700 at the time of Hezekiah. We have the royal annals of the Assyrian king who was doing that. And so we have, the biblical version of it, and we have the Assyrian version of it. And so we can see, and actually they differ on some significant details, but they also agree in the general picture. When you have that sort of stuff, you can really do a close historical analysis. So it takes evidence. And without that kind of external evidence, there's a lot of, internal feeling around and inference and chains of arguments and kind of imaginative speculation too.
So if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, one of the things that I read once that really struck me the most was that in the book of Genesis, for example, there's a lot of talk of camels. And if you look at the time that the book of Genesis would purport to be about, the camel had not yet been domesticated. So that kind of tells you, well, it can't actually have been written contemporaneously, or it can't be fully historically right because it's talking about an animal that was walking around that wouldn't have been there. So you kind of know when it wasn't.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that, but also about, for example, in the linguistic evidence? I mean, another thing that I've heard, and I wonder if this is correct, that some people look at the stories in the book of Samuel and the book of Kings, the stories about David and Solomon in that era, and say, well, the agenda of the book seems to be about Solomon and making sure that people accept his kingship, that he was actually David's son, that he was really the right person to be in the job. But other people have said, no, those books were really put into place much, much later. If it doesn't have words that are taken from, for example, Persian, then you would be surprised if it was written during the time when the Persian Empire was occupying that part of the land, because you expect, like in Israel today, there's a lot of English words, because America is a dominant cultural force. So if you see Persian loanwords in there, that doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't have been written earlier because maybe some guy from Persia came along and told them some cool words. But if you don't see the Persian loan words, then you suspect that maybe it was actually written before there would have been substantial contact. Is that how you might look at language?
That's one of the ways that it works. And this is actually the same principle as your camel thing in Genesis, that if camels, were not on the scene before 1200 BC, and Abraham owns a bunch of camels, then you say, well, this was written, sometime after 1200 BC and doesn't reflect an earlier period. Someone's imagining Abraham, but someone who's doing the imagining is from 1200 or later. If I see a picture of George Washington wearing an Apple Watch, I can tell pretty clearly that someone drew that picture pretty recently now and it wasn't a live portrait that George Washington sat for. So these little anachronisms are little flags that say, oh, well, we can tell when this representation was done. In books that you find Persian loan words, you can tell, well, that was written, probably during the Persian period when the Persian Empire ruled over ancient Israel. When you find Greek loan words, you can say, oh, well, this is in the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. So there's, for example, in the book of Daniel, there's a beautiful little band that plays in one of the, I think it's in Daniel chapter 2, it's playing for this Babylonian king. But the band, the names of the instruments are Greek words. And so you can tell this is a little Greek orchestra. So the person who wrote that was writing it during the Hellenistic period. So these are the kinds of anachronisms that give you a bright red line and tells you couldn't have been written before this time. In Samuel, we don't have Persian loan words. We don't have Greek loan words. We don't have influences of Aramaic grammar, which is what many Jews were speaking during the Second Temple period. These are some of the number of reasons to conclude that it was written before that period.
I'm curious, in this unit where we're talking about the Bible, you just unpacked how in, say, the book of Daniel, which has these loan words, is a much later book than, other books. You didn't talk about these, but I know that, for example, some of the songs that are in various parts of the Bible, like the Song of Deborah, Song of the Sea, are often associated with times many, many centuries before, say, the book of Daniel. And yet, end of the day, we're having this unit of conversations and we're talking about the Bible. And I'm curious, how you would approach that. After, a long, long period of time, this set of books were put into conversation with each other, canonized or whatever language we want to use. And we treat them as one coherent thing. But what you're talking about is that end of the day, they're really not. It's as if we grabbed something from 1,000 years ago in a very, very ancient form of English or maybe Latin. I don't even know what would be the right analogy here, and put that alongside, emoji conversations in text messages now, and put that all in one book and said that's the book, the Bible. So I guess I'm asking, should we reconsider how we talk about the Bible, and should we consider how the beautiful diversity within the text itself, of its different time periods, of its different geographies, all of that could not be some sign that it's impure, but actually a sign that there's some really cool, I don't know, trans-chronological or trans-geographic conversations happening? Or should we stop talking about it as one coherent thing and maybe talk about it as if it's multiple things? I'm curious how you approach that.
If you're interested in history and time and cultural change and diversity of ideas and things like that, which I am, I think it's very, very cool to discover that when you kind of open the hood and look inside the Bible, it's 1,000 years span of different stuff. The old poetry that you were talking about, that was written in what we call archaic biblical Hebrew. And so that's from maybe 1100, 1000 BC. The book of Daniel, which is written in late biblical Hebrew, that's from the 3rd and 2nd century BCE. And there might be some little bits and pieces that are even later than that. So that's almost 1,000-year span worth of stuff. And not only is it chronologically stratified, there's totally different points of view. People disagree about basic issues, about issues of God, about religious practice, about morality, about politics. And so to get into the motor and see the different strata and the different things that are going on, to me, it makes the Bible so interesting. But at the same time, once, as you say, once the car was put together with all these different pieces, it runs. People read the Bible and have read the Bible and have seen all sorts of things in it. But again, to me, that also is interestingly diverse because people have done all sorts of different things with the Bible. In the American Civil War, the Bible was used to uphold the legitimacy of slavery. The Bible was also used to critique the morality of slavery. So abolitionists and slave owners were both citing the Bible for their purposes. And I think it's more interesting when you see that it has this complicated birth and life and development.
So you just used a phrase that gets me really jazzed, which is you talked about the Bible having a birth and a life. I was struck in your book on Genesis. You have a book that looks at Genesis through the lens of a biography. It's part of a series that we love on Judaism Unbound, and we've featured others in this series in the past, looking at different religious books as if they are sort of a person. I mean, it's like the biography of each various book. One recent one we had was with Vanessa Oakes on the biography of the Passover Haggadah. And there's a way in which you could hear that as like, oh, cute, like biography, but it's a book. It's not a person. But I also think there's a reality to that. It is a biography. This gains a kind of life that, sure, I'm not going to claim is the same as an organic life form, but is powerful. And in certain senses, you could argue it's more powerful than those of us, like the three of us in this conversation, who actually will have a death. Like we're not immortal. Like some of these books, the Bible has lasted for thousands of years. And if you think of that as a life, its life is longer than my life. So how do you think about sort of that life, that death, that development with the Bible? I mean, I know you talked about it with Genesis in particular, and I am curious about that book, especially since it's the first one. But if you have thoughts more broadly about the Bible in the sense that you're talking about, in the sense that it has become a kind of unit in a coherent whole, what's the life? What's the death? What's the development?
Yeah. On the one hand, it's a metaphor that a book is born and then has a kind of life in the minds of its readers and interpreters. I mean, in a sense, the life of the Bible is how it works in the life of the people who read it and the life of the people who live in a society in which the Bible is a presence. In that respect, it's more than just a metaphor. It's the way the Bible is enmeshed in the life of Western civilization, both in Jewish civilization, Christian civilization, also Islamic civilization. So it's more than just a metaphor. It's a way of understanding how the Bible has kind of circulated and been negotiated and been the object of conflict and controversy and insight over the whole span of Western civilization, and for thousands of years. So it really is, I think, a powerful idea. Now, what I would say is that there's a kind of doubleness there. On the one hand, there's a kind of original life. And here I'm actually drawing on some ideas of Walter Benjamin. There's a kind of original life of the Bible. The Genesis came together and was written by this person and that person, and Samuel has this relationship to the life of King David, and so on and so forth. But once the whole thing is put together, it then has what Benjamin calls its afterlife or its survival. And through its survival, it has a kind of another life that is layered on top of the original life. And I would say that even, you talk about a life also entailing a death. Well, there are chapters of the life of the Bible that entail the death of certain things. One example is the German philosopher Nietzsche, who proclaimed the death of God. Okay, so if God dies, that's the death of something that's kind of important in the Bible. And he was specifically talking about the, Judeo-Christian concept of God. But what I find fascinating is that the book in which he promulgated that idea is modeled after the Bible. The book is called Thus Spake Zarathustra. And Zarathustra is Nietzsche's version of Moses and has this revelation on a mountain, which is his version of Mount Sinai. And Zarathustra comes down from the mountain and proclaims this revelation to the people. And his revelation is that God is dead. That's a different revelation than Moses gives to the people of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, but it's modeled after the same thing. That is to say, he's using biblical concepts and biblical language to proclaim, in his mind, the death of the Bible. In proclaiming the death of the Bible, he's perpetuating the Bible. He's reimagining it in the terms of his philosophy. But the Bible is alive and well in the hands of Nietzsche. So I think that's a really nice example of a powerful chapter of the Bible, which is both a death and a continued life of the Bible.
It feels like one could say very similar things to what you just said about those Babylonian myths that Genesis takes and repurposes, right? You could say, in a way, the author of Genesis is doing with the Babylonian myth of the flood exactly what Nietzsche is doing with the story of the Exodus.
That's good. That's a very perceptive comment. I think if you were a student in my class, you'd get an A for that.
All right.
That would be a good paper.
Dang it, Dan. That's the second guest from the field of biblical history that has given Dan an A on our podcast, the first being Richard Elliott Friedman. And I think I got a B+ for whatever I said with Richard Elliott. So, Dan, you're just destroying me.
Friedman is a superb scholar, and I agree with his grading scale.
Well, I'm a fan of this area, but I hadn't really thought about it that way before. So I'm curious, to what extent can we say anything that is speculation, which is not necessarily bad, but I'm curious about the distinction between speculation versus things that for some reason we know at an even better degree than speculation, about what the ancient Israelites were trying to do with the myths that became the architecture of the first part of Genesis. Not only what you think they were doing, but I guess I'm also asking whether we can identify, and to the extent that we can, what is it, a unique Israelite take on the mythology and the ideas that were in their milieu, but really it was the Israelites who took that stuff in a different direction. And if so, what was that direction?
In the Babylonian flood story, the hero is named Utnapishtim. In another version, he's called Atrahasis. In the biblical story, he's called Noah. But we even have two stories, one from the J source and one from the P source. If you want to know more about that, read Professor Friedman's book on who wrote the Bible. So we have multiple versions of the flood story from Babylonia and from Israel. And you can read them closely and see how they are articulating and transforming certain themes. I like your transition from Nietzsche doing this to the Bible to Genesis doing this to Babylonian literature, because it is very much the same thing. The birth of the Bible itself is a kind of rebirth of older ideas. If God will forgive me, it didn't just come from Mount Sinai. It came from older ideas about religion, about creation, about ethics, about reality that were circulating in the ancient Near East. Now, one thing that is important in this regard is to realize that ancient Israel was a newcomer in the ancient Near East, and they were self-conscious of that. They knew that they were a new young nation in the ancient Near East, that they emerged, out of Egyptian slavery and so forth. These are old civilizations that they're talking about, that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, that the Tower of Babel was way back in the past. They knew that ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt had been around for way longer than they had. And they knew that they were a young culture. And we can see this in their use of older stories and older ideas, that they are making them their own. The Babylonian flood story revolves around a conflict between two gods. One is Enlil, the high god, who's a little bit grumpy. and humans make too much noise, and he can't get a good night's sleep. So he wants to destroy all of humans, eventually with a flood, to get them to shut up so he can have a good night's sleep. Now, he's not depicted very admirably. The other god, named Enki, is the wise god who created humans. And he has great compassion for humans. They're his creatures. And he's the one that saves the humans from Enki's wrath by telling his favorite human to build a boat. And then at the end, Enlil shows up and says, "What? Why are people still alive?" And Enki says, "You shouldn't have done this. This was immoral." And Enlil is kind of abashed, and the other gods join in. He says, okay, this won't happen again. And he even gives immortality to the flood survivors, to Mr. and Mrs. Flood survivor. Now, in the biblical story, there's only one God. In order to tell this story, the same God has to be the one who destroys humans in the flood and the one who creates them and saves them. One of the things that this does is make a portrait of a God who has internal ethical conflicts. These are the sorts of things that we see are innovations, even in the concept of God in the ancient Israelite story. And you see it when you put it next to the Babylonian story, which we know is much older. It's older by, roughly 1,000 years to the biblical story. So you can see where things come from. There's also details in the biblical story that show that they were borrowed or descended from the Babylonian story. So it's not just a coincidence that these two stories existed. So that's one of the really wonderful things about Genesis, is that we can see these things, and it's not just speculation, because we have these older texts from other cultures.
As I was listening to you describing that merging of two gods into one, two perspectives into one, I'm curious to whether you visited the Creation Museum, which is near Cincinnati. And my family and I went there one time. It was one of the best days of my life, but it was so strange, but it's a museum of a particular strain of Christianity that really takes Genesis extremely literally. And, for example, one of my favorite exhibits was this one that talks about who did Cain marry if there were no other people around? And the answer is that he must have married his sister, because where else would any women have come from? So she's not mentioned, but the only parents that could have been are Adam and Eve. So he must have married his sister. But don't worry about the issues that you might be concerned about in terms of recessive diseases and whatnot, because the whole reason why we don't have incest today, why we're against incest today, is because of the fear of double recessive diseases. But those come from mutations. And when you're talking about the second generation of people that ever walked the earth, there wouldn't have been any time for mutations. So there's no concern that there's a problem in the genes. And so it's okay that a person married a sister. And that was the level of taking this so literally.
Dan, are you an evangelical Christian now? I'm excited about this development.
Well, I can make the argument, but it was actually it was almost like brilliantly off, right? But it just struck me as, wow, this is not what the author of Genesis had in mind, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, no, this is an amazing example. This is another chapter in the life of Genesis, or a chapter in the life of the Bible. This Creation Museum in Kentucky, it's one of my favorite things, and it's on my bucket list. I haven't been there yet, but I actually, in one of my classes, I give people a virtual tour of it because people have taken so many slides of it. And I have a student who's now a professor at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and so he's going to take me on a tour of it next time I'm there. It's an amazing thing simply visually that this Creation Museum is constructed on the model of a natural history museum. And there's even animatronic dinosaurs in there. And of course, there's the animatronic dinosaurs are in the Garden of Eden, okay? Because, these people believe that there wasn't enough time. The world was created in 4004 BC, and so dinosaurs were simultaneous with humans and such. So these people are fundamentalists, and they're trying to read Genesis in particular as a scientific treatise. Every detail in it is a fact, is a scientific fact. And so to do that, the intellectual contortions that they have to make are just mind-bending. When the flood receded, it created the Grand Canyon, which, took a long time to make. the Grand Canyon. Like the Colorado River didn't make that in 6 hours, but they have to tell you how it did. So they are doing these amazing contortions. It's like a Cirque du Soleil of fundamentalism. They are combining the life of the Bible with the life of modern science and saying, see, we can do a scientific explanation of the world using the data that's in the Bible. And it's just an amazing performance. It's all totally false, but it's an amazing performance. What I would emphasize is how new this moment is. Okay, they think that they're preaching the old time religion, but they're not. They are using scientific language from the 20th century and combining it with the Bible. This is a very recent phenomenon. People never used to talk like this before. Augustine doesn't talk like this. Martin Luther doesn't talk like this. John Calvin doesn't talk like this. This is a modern weird fusion, a rationalizing fusion of science-like stuff, science-ish language with the Bible. And it's just an amazing through the looking glass kind of world.
I was struck by what you said about genre earlier, and I'm continually struck. I read some scholarly pieces looking at, I don't even remember if it was biblical texts in particular or if it was later Jewish texts, but when you ask that question of any written work, like what is the genre? Like a lot opens up, because if something is a song versus if it's prose, that can be different. I mean, I'm flashing to a conversation we had a few months back with a guest where I argued that like Lamentations, the book, should be translated in acrostic in English, because I think that the original document, since it's written in an acrostic form, that's like a core part of its genre. Yes. Like it's, and so I sort of expressed my big hatred, it's not real hatred, against all the translations that are not acrostics, that are just, looking at the words of the text and putting it in prose form. Fine. But I am curious, to the extent we do now have this sort of 5-book Torah, with a lot of different texts and authors participating in its formation, like I am interested in the genre question of what it might be, because a lot of these conversations and a lot of Jewish conversations generally, when we talk about Torah, I think we dwell on the stuff that's like most easily digestible and juiciest, like the stories. Genesis is full of these beautiful, almost like soap opera stories, family drama, etc. Exodus has an incredible narrative of, Exodus, of exiting Egypt. So much, like such a high percentage of the Torah is not that. And it makes genre questions interesting, because people forget the whole, like half of Exodus is a meandering conversation about the dimensions of the tabernacle and the colors that are used for it and the materials that are used for it. And like, if I were writing a book now in any respect, it would either be a story or an arts and crafts manual. It wouldn't be both. And Exodus is both. And Leviticus, it's this rule book in certain senses, or life philosophy book. And then like, oh, by the way, random story about Nadav and Abihu, 2 sons of Aaron being stricken by God, like quick meander to give you a story that's like 3 verses long. And, we could go to the list. Numbers. I've mentioned a bunch of times that I find the story of, Balaam and his talking donkey to be like this bizarre commercial break in the midst of wandering in the wilderness. And like, there's some rules here and some stories here. And Deuteronomy just decides, oh, we're going to show a bunch of reruns. Like, but they're actually a little different this time. Like, we're going to tell a bunch of the stories you've already heard, but here they are a second time with some twists. And I'm curious, like, we could look at that and say, okay, there's different authors and there's different time periods. So to ask, like, what is the genre of this whole book is kind of an absurdist exercise. We could also say, it's now a thing. So what should we be treating it as being? Is it an arts and crafts manual? Is it a story? Is it a philosophy book? Is it all of it? What is this thing?
Of course, the most important part are the lists of genealogies. Okay, this is what everyone always skips over. But the genealogies are a central binding connective tissue for the whole Torah. And I would say that in some ways, the genealogical structure is kind of what makes a book out of these stories, laws, architectural manuals for the tabernacle. it's a kind of all-encompassing story. It's an all-encompassing representation of the past that includes all of those things, stories and laws and how-to manuals and such. But they're linked by genealogies. And I think that's very important because it gives a structure to it. It gives a connectiveness to it. And even when there's different, subgenres, the genealogies all link it together in a kind of temporal connective succession. And this happens beginning in the beginning. Okay, after the creation story in Genesis 1, it says, these are the generations of heaven and earth when they were created. This phrase, these are the generations of, starts in the creation itself when it's not even talking about people. It's talking about the things of the world. When time and space begins begins this genealogical progression that then culminates in the Torah with the laws of Mount Sinai and then the wanderings in the desert and coming up to the boundary of the promised land. I want to emphasize that the Torah ends on a kind of beautifully tragic, poignant note, that it's all building up to founding the people of Israel in the land of Israel that was promised to Abraham and so forth. But it ends with the death of Moses. He's on a mountain looking into the promised land, but he can't go into it. The guy who's done more than anything to get people out of Egypt and get them through the desert, and they've been kvetching the whole time and saying, let's go back. At least there we had garlic and onions and stuff, and now here there's just desert. He gets them there, and then he has to die. It's very poignant. This goes back to what Dan was saying before. These are not cartoon characters. These are complicated people, and there's tragedy, and there's happiness, and there's joy, and there's like unknowable depths to their characters and destinies and stuff. So it's an amazing ending for a book where you don't get there, but you can see it. It's like you can almost touch it, you can almost taste it, but then you die before you get there. So it's a happy and sad ending to the book, which is an amazing way to end a book that starts with the creation of the world.
That actually leads to a question that I've been thinking about, and I'm curious your take as a scholar, meaning if you really know the answer to this, I'd be very excited, but I'd also be excited about speculations. But my question is fundamentally about the hand of the redactor, the hand of the person who is the final editor of this book, let's say of the Torah. Because I'm thinking about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare took older stories and wove them together, but then he basically rewrote his plays. And I don't think that you can really see the different strata within Shakespeare. I mean, I'm not sure, but I don't think that Shakespeare scholars really say, oh, he took the language from this previous story and this previous story. He's like, no, he rewrote the whole thing in his language. And therefore you can look at a Shakespeare play as a single work of literature and to say, what was Shakespeare really trying to do here? How was he trying to have you feel at the end? But I'm also thinking about that it feels to some extent like the biblical redactor didn't actually cover his tracks very well and maybe didn't even try. And so I'm wondering whether, for example, at the time of the redaction of the Bible, it would have been obvious to everybody that this was a composite work that was more like a library than a single story, or whether they were trying to sell it to the people as a single composition, and only now later are we the first to recognize, 200 years, however many years ago, that it really is very much a composite. And one reason I'm really interested in this question too is because in the Jewish world, I think it's pretty accepted. Everybody accepts that the Talmud is a composite document, and all of these conversations are constructed and didn't really happen among each other, and these are people from different generations. And at one point, I had this feeling like, hey, maybe the Talmud is actually continuing. Lex was talking about a genre. The Talmud is actually continuing a genre of Jewish literature that the Bible itself exemplifies, which is this kind of collection of material from different periods that's not actually pretending to be a single work. It's not, that claim is only a claim that was made in the post history of the Bible and may not actually have been the original claim, or even for a long period of time.
When we look at the work of the redactor, And you're right, the redactor was not a writer like Shakespeare. The redactor wasn't transforming the material that he read into what he wrote. The redactor was of the Torah very persnickety, was very careful in preserving as much of the source texts as he could. And we can see this, I mean, the flood story is a very nice example of this. You can see he made some transitions. In the J story, Noah brings on board 7 pairs of all the clean animals and 1 pair of the unclean animals. And he does this so he can make a sacrifice afterwards of all the species, of animals from each species without all of those species going extinct. Whereas in the P version, he just brings 1 pair of each animal. But the P version doesn't have a sacrifice, because otherwise, again, any animal you sacrifice, if there's only 1 pair of each, would go extinct. So the redactor makes a bridge between some of these things and says, oh, they took 7 pair of this and 2 pair of that, and male and female and this and that. This softens those contrasts. And so I think the redactor was trying to create a single text, and you can see where he felt that there was too much difference because he adds a little transitional bridge there. But I think the text that he ended up completing was intended to be something that was readable from beginning to end. And it is, because people have been reading it from beginning to end for 2,000 years. So I don't think people necessarily thought that this was, I don't think people necessarily saw the theme, the seams between these different texts, because the redactor did a very nice job, because the seams themselves are kind of like, invisible tape that smooths out the kind of harsh transitions from one text to another. Having said that, I do think it's clear that the kinds of discussions that the rabbis have in the Talmud, particularly about legal complexities, were perceived right away. So, for example, in the book of Chronicles, we see that they're reading laws in the book of Exodus that are from one source and laws in the book of Deuteronomy that are from another source, and noticing that those laws are different. And they harmonize those laws. For example, in Exodus, it says you're supposed to burn the Passover sacrifice on fire, right? You roast it in fire. In Deuteronomy, it says you take the Passover sacrifice and you boil it in a pot with water. The author of Chronicles is talking about the Passover, and he says, well, look, there's 2 different things that people said here in one book and the other book. And so he concludes by harmonizing them, by bringing them together and say, you boil it on fire. Boil it in water, but on top of a fire. You see what I mean? And this is precisely the kind of legal judgments that the rabbis make in the Talmud to harmonize different biblical laws or to make laws fit new circumstances and so forth. So this kind of very detailed attention to the Bible and to details, particularly in ritual laws, is going on in the biblical period by the first readers of the text. And they're having the same kinds of interpretive responses and using the same techniques to interpret it that the later rabbis are doing.
There's a lot of little things in Torah that when you look at them from this lens of, we started with how old is the text, but really more generally, like sort of what's lurking underneath these tiny little linguistic choices or doubled narratives. Like when you open up to that, so much beautiful meaning can be unlocked in a way that I think is important and so counter what some of us, initially thought, which is that, if you sort of break the idea that the Torah is that factual science textbook that the museum think it is, like people just won't be interested in it anymore. So I'm just like really thrilled about that. As a closing note, I'm curious, are there any other, little passing phrases or moments in Torah that somebody could read 47 times each year of their life at synagogue or whatever and not notice some interesting thing about them? Is there anything else that you would point out to as a pivotal moment in Torah that we might not have considered before as we bid farewell?
Well, that's a tough question, because I would say the whole thing. The way that the Torah is written, the style in which it is written, the literary style, is very terse. Okay, the story of, Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, it's just one little chapter. It's like 20 verses long. So there's a lot that is condensed and conveyed in very short sentences and very, terse language. So I think that what I would say is to learn to read the Bible closely and to learn to appreciate the terse suggestiveness, which is the deliberate style in which the Bible is written, is precisely a way to find all of these little teeny things that just can blow your mind. Let me just give an example from Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. So there's just one dialogue between them. They're walking for 3 days, the father and the son, and the son has wood on his shoulder and his father's carrying a knife and he's never been told what's going on. And then all of a sudden, Isaac says something and there's a tiny little dialogue. It only takes like 1 or 2 verses. And he says, "My father." And Abraham says, "Yes, my son." And even just there, they haven't said anything yet. But the repetition of "my father, my son," in the context of knowing that the father is about to murder his son, has such poignancy. And the son says, "Father, here's the wood and here's the fire for the sacrifice. Where's the lamb?" And your heart breaks. Just that little thing. And what's the father to do? "Oh, we don't need a lamb, my son, because, I'm going to kill you." He doesn't say that. He says, "God will provide the lamb, my son." And the rabbis take that because they're very attentive to the details. And the rabbis said, well, Abraham wasn't, lying or anything. Because if you take away that comma, it says the lamb is my son. God will provide the lamb, my son. But he is kind of putting off answering. It's a kind of deceptive answer. And yet, it's a heartbreaking answer. How can Abraham say something like that to deceive his son and he's about to kill him? So the poignancy, the psychological weight, the trauma that's just in the speaking of each of those words is so powerful. And yet, in one of the wonderful ironies of the story, at the end, God does provide a lamb. I mean, it's actually a ram, but it's the same. In Hebrew, it's the same category of animal, a caprid. God does provide it, but Abraham doesn't know it at that point. It's a tiny little dialogue between the two, but there's so much going on because the biblical writer is stylistically packing so much in there. So this goes to your point. There's so many little teeny things, but I think it's deliberate. It's a deliberate result of the literary style of the biblical writers that the little things have tremendous kind of resonance.
That little colon that you added is going to affect my read of the Abraham and Isaac story that I've read, 150 times. Thank you so much, Ronald Hendel, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
My pleasure.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you will continue on with us through this unit of episodes on Torah and on Bible. As a reminder, this was our first crack at a conversation looking at the Torah, looking at the Bible, and we thought it was a great one. There are so many more coming your way over the next many, many weeks. So we hope that you will hop aboard and check out the Torah and the Bible from many, many, many different kinds of perspectives. So can't wait. Hope you'll join us. And as a last note, we always love to encourage all of you out there listening to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter or our Instagram, also at Judaism Unbound. Those are all the handles. Third, you can go to our email addresses, send to, that's probably the right verb, lex@judaismunbound.com or dan@judaismunbound.com. And you can head to our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, we appreciate it when you are able and if you are willing to send a donation our way. That means a lot to us, and you can do so at judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.